March 25, 1911. The eighth floor of the Ash building on Green Street in Lower Manhattan. 4:15 on a Saturday afternoon, and the air inside the Triangle Waste Company is thick enough to chew. 600 workers, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrant women, some as young as 14, hunched over their sewing machines in the suffocating heat of a New York spring. The windows are closed, locked from the outside to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. The air doesn't move. It just hangs there, dense with fabric dust that coats your throat, gets in your eyes, makes every breath feel like you're inhaling cotton. Under the cutting tables, scraps of linen, silk, and cotton lawn have been accumulating for 2 months. Nobody's swept. The foreman says there's no time, production quotas are climbing, and the Easter season means rush orders for shirtwaists, those fashionable high-necked blouses that every working woman in America wants to own. The scrap bins overflow. Tissue paper patterns flutter and fall. The floor is carpeted 6 inches deep in combustible material, and above it all hangs the lint, suspended in the still air like snow that never falls. On the 8th floor, a cutter named Samuel Bernstein strikes a match. Or maybe it's a cigarette. Accounts differ, though smoking was supposedly forbidden. Or perhaps it's a spark from one of the electric cutting machines, still relatively new technology that factory owners barely understood. The exact ignition point has been debated for over a century, but what happened next is beyond dispute. The flame touches the fabric scraps under table 14. For perhaps 3 seconds, nothing seems wrong. Then the fire spreads laterally across the floor at a speed that defies human comprehension, racing through the accumulated detritus like gasoline. The suspended lint ignites next, and suddenly, the entire 8th floor is engulfed in flames that reach the 14-foot ceiling in less than a minute. The temperature climbs to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the time it takes to scream. Industrial fires were grimly routine in 1911 America. The previous year had seen dozens of major factory blazes, in New York, in Chicago, in Boston, each one claiming lives, making brief headlines, then fading from memory. America was in the throes of explosive industrial growth, and fire was simply the cost of progress. Factories were tinderboxes by design, wood frame construction, open flames for lighting and heating, volatile materials stored without precaution, workers packed shoulder to shoulder to maximize floor space. Insurance companies had calculated the risk and found it acceptable. Factory owners paid their premiums and rebuilt when necessary. Workers were replaceable. But the Triangle fire was different, and within minutes, everyone in Lower Manhattan would know it. The factory occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building that was, ironically, considered modern and fireproof. The steel frame construction meant the building itself wouldn't collapse, but fireproof meant the structure survived. It said nothing about the people inside. The Triangle's owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, had already survived 7 fires in their various factories over the previous decade. They called them the cloak makers, behind closed doors, as if casual about their partnership with disaster. They'd collected substantial insurance payouts each time and had learned to see fire as a manageable business risk. They stored inventory on the top floors, away from ground-level theft. They kept the stairwell doors locked from the outside, a common practice to prevent workers from stealing fabric or taking unauthorized breaks. They'd installed a fire escape, but it was a flimsy iron structure designed more for show than function, terminating at the 2nd floor without reaching the ground. When the flames erupted on the 8th floor that Saturday, the cutters and sewers had seconds to react. Some made for the stairwells, only to find the doors locked or blocked. Others rushed to the single fire escape, which would soon collapse under their weight. A handful managed to reach the freight elevators, which made a few heroic trips before the shafts filled with smoke and the operators abandoned their posts. The 9th and 10th floors, where management worked and fabric was stored, had better access to escape routes. The 8th floor had none. The fire department received the alarm at 4:45 p.m. They arrived within minutes, their horse-drawn engines clattering over the cobblestones, but their ladders reached only to the 6th floor. The water pressure was adequate for the height, but by then it was far too late. The workers on the 8th floor had already made their terrible calculations. This wasn't just another factory fire. This was the moment when industrial America's casual relationship with worker safety finally produced a disaster so public, so visible, so impossible to ignore that it forced the nation to confront what it had been willing to accept. The first thing you need to understand about industrial fire is the speed, not the gradual spread you might imagine, where people have time to organize an evacuation, where someone pulls an alarm and everyone files out in orderly rows. No. In a space packed with fabric, tissue paper, wooden tables, and lint-saturated air, fire moves like a living creature that's been starved and suddenly released. It doesn't creep, it explodes. Rose Friedman, 17 years old, sitting at her machine near the Washington Place side of the 8th floor, looked up from her work to see a wall of orange light racing toward her across the ceiling. She later described it as moving faster than a man could run, faster than seemed possible. The sound was like wind, she said, like standing at the edge of a cliff in a storm. The heat hit her face before the flames reached her position, a searing wave that made her skin feel like it was shrinking. The first instinct for most was the Green Street stairwell. It was supposed to be an exit, and perhaps 100 workers surged toward it in those initial seconds. They found the door locked. Whether this was malice, negligence, or simply the routine practice of controlling worker movement, the effect was the same. Bodies piled against that door in a crushing mass as the flames advanced behind them. Some women beat their fists bloody against the metal. Others, realizing the futility, turned back into the fire to seek another route. The narrow corridor between the sewing machine tables became a fatal bottleneck. The machines were arranged in long rows with barely 2 feet between them, efficient for production, catastrophic for evacuation. Women squeezed through, their long skirts catching fire, the flames spreading from dress to dress in a chain reaction. The fabric of the era, cotton, linen, silk, burned with enthusiastic speed. A woman's entire dress could be engulfed in seconds. Ethel Monick, a skilled draper earning $12 a week, managed to stay calm long enough to direct a group of younger girls toward the freight elevators on the Washington Place side. The elevator operators, Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillalo, were making desperate trips up and down, cramming as many bodies as possible into cars designed for freight, not passengers. 20, 30, sometimes 40 people squeezed in where 12 should have been. Monick shoved girls forward, counting them off, staying behind each time to ensure the next group was ready. On the 4th or 5th trip, accounts vary, the elevator shaft became choked with smoke so thick that Zito couldn't see the floor indicators. He made one more run blind, guided by the screams above him, before the heat became unbearable and he had to abandon the effort. Up on the 8th floor, those who couldn't reach the elevators faced increasingly limited options. The fire escape beckoned, a zigzagging iron structure bolted to the building's exterior. It looked substantial enough, at least from inside. What the workers couldn't see was that it had been installed hastily, inadequately anchored, and had never been tested with significant weight. The first dozen women who stepped onto it found it serviceable. It swayed alarmingly, and the metal was already hot from the flames licking through the windows, but it held. Then came the rush. 50, 60, perhaps 70 women crowded onto a structure designed for ordered evacuation, not panicked escape. Kate Leone, a 21-year-old from Sicily, was halfway down the first flight when she felt the entire structure shudder. There was a sound like a ship's hull buckling, a deep metallic groan that rose in pitch. The iron bolts began pulling free from the brick. The fire escape peeled away from the building slowly at first, almost gently, then with sudden violence. It twisted, folded, and collapsed, taking everyone on it down into the courtyard below. Bodies fell 5 stories onto iron and concrete. Those who survived the fire escape's collapse were crushed by those who fell on top of them. Back inside, the smoke was now the greater killer. The black, oily smoke from burning fabric and wood filled the upper portion of the room first, then descended like a curtain. Visibility dropped to inches. The air became unbreathable, not just hot, but chemically transformed, stripped of oxygen, laden with carbon monoxide. Women dropped to their knees, then to their stomachs, crawling toward anywhere that might offer air. Some found pockets of breathable atmosphere near the floor, but these were temporary sanctuaries. The fire consumed the oxygen as it advanced. The windows offered one final terrible option. The Ash Building's windows opened onto Green Street and Washington Place, overlooking sidewalks 8 stories below. Crowds had already gathered. Word of the fire had spread through the neighborhood in minutes. People stood watching, helpless, as women appeared at the windows, backlit by orange flames, their clothes smoking. The first woman to jump did so alone. She stood in the window frame for perhaps 5 seconds, looking down at the crowd, then stepped off into space. She fell silently, or perhaps she screamed, and the wind took it, and struck the pavement with such force that witnesses heard the impact a block away. The crowd surged back horrified, but there was nowhere to go. More women appeared at the windows. Some jumped alone, some in pairs holding hands, some in groups of 3 or 4 with their arms linked. The fire nets that the firefighters stretched out below were worse than useless. They'd been designed for single jumpers from modest heights, not multiple bodies falling 8 stories. The nets tore on the first impact. Firefighters tried holding blankets, but the force of the falling bodies ripped the fabric from their hands or pulled them off their feet. One firefighter, Louis Brown, later testified that he caught 2 women and felt his arms nearly torn from their sockets by the impact. When a third landed in his blanket, the fabric disintegrated, and all 3, the 2 jumpers and Brown, were thrown to the ground. The 9th floor had it marginally better. The workers there had access to the Green Street stairwell before it became impassable, and to a set of interior stairs that led to the roof. When the fire erupted below them, many ran upward instead of down, bursting through the 10th floor where management and cutting room staff were evacuating. The roof offered a chance. Students from New York University, whose building abutted the Ash Building, threw ladders across the gap between rooftops. Perhaps 70 or 80 people escaped this way, crossing over hand while flames erupted from the windows below them. But for those trapped on the 8th floor, the mathematics were simple and brutal. The stairwell doors were locked. The elevators had stopped running. The fire escape had collapsed. The windows offered a choice between burning and falling. In 18 minutes, the fire consumed everything combustible on the 8th floor. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. Elevator operator Joseph Zito knew, on his 4th trip up into the smoke, that he wouldn't survive many more runs. The shaft was filling with heat and fumes. The cables groaned under loads they were never meant to carry. Women were throwing themselves down the shaft now from upper floors, trying to land on the elevator car, their bodies impacting the roof with sickening thuds. Zito, 23 years old, had started his shift at noon expecting routine freight runs. Now he was operating an emergency rescue vehicle in conditions that would have made hardened firefighters hesitate. He kept going. 5th trip, 6th. The mechanism was responding sluggishly now. The heat was affecting the cables, or perhaps the motor in the basement was overheating. The door on the 8th floor wouldn't close properly anymore because bodies were jamming the threshold. Zito would open the gate, and women would cascade in like water, not waiting for the previous load to clear, just desperate to be inside anything that moved away from the flames. He stopped trying to count. He just filled the car until he couldn't physically close the gate, then dropped as fast as the overloaded machinery would allow. On the 7th trip, the car stuck between floors. Zito could hear the screaming above him, women calling down the shaft, begging him to come back. He worked the controls, coaxing the elevator down inch by inch until it finally lurched free. He made 2 more runs, each one slower than the last, the heat in the shaft now approaching unbearable levels. The 10th and final trip, he got perhaps 15 women aboard before the car simply refused to rise anymore. The motor was burning out, or the cables were compromised, or the heat had warped the shaft. He brought those final 15 down and then collapsed on the ground floor, his hands blistered, his lungs seared. He'd saved perhaps 150 people. Nobody pinned a medal on him. His name appears in the testimony records and then vanishes from history. Across the floor on the Washington Place side, 22-year-old Mary Buccelli made a different calculation. She worked on the ninth floor, had access to the roof, could have saved herself easily. Instead, when she saw the smoke rising from below, she ran down the internal staircase to the eighth floor and began pulling women away from the locked door where they'd clustered. "The roof!" she shouted in Italian, in Yiddish, in broken English. "Go up, not down." Some listened. Most didn't. Their instinct was to escape down and out, not up into an unknown space. Buccelli grabbed arms, physically dragged women toward the stairwell that led upward. She got perhaps 20 women redirected before the smoke became too thick and she had to save herself. She survived. Her name appears once in a survivor's testimony, mentioned in passing as the woman who told us to go to the roof. No newspaper interviewed her. No historian chronicled her actions in detail. She returned to garment work within weeks and disappeared into the anonymity of immigrant labor. Then there was the man on the street, whose name we don't know at all. A witness described him only as a tall man in a good coat, probably middle class, possibly a professional, definitely not from the neighborhood. When the bodies started falling, most of the crowd surged backward in horror, a natural human response to witnessing mass death. This man moved forward instead. He positioned himself beneath the windows and began trying to catch the jumpers, or at least break their fall. He was knocked down repeatedly, his arms clearly broken after the first few impacts, but he kept staggering to his feet and positioning himself under the next falling woman. Witnesses said he was crying and shouting something they couldn't make out. He caught or partially caught at least 6 women before the police pulled him away forcibly. An ambulance took him to Bellevue Hospital. No record of his admission survives. His identity remains unknown. On the 10th floor, where Triangle's owners Blank and Harris had their offices, a different drama unfolded. When the fire erupted, someone, accounts disagree on who, telephoned the 10th floor to warn them. This gave the management and office staff crucial extra seconds. They evacuated relatively smoothly to the roof. But here, a peculiar grace note. Bookkeeper Morris Lifskitz, instead of fleeing immediately, ran through the 10th floor shouting warnings and making sure everyone was moving toward the roof stairs. Then he ran back to the telephone and called down to the 8th floor, trying to warn the workers there. The line was dead. The fire had already consumed the lower floor's communication equipment. Lifskitz could have stopped then. The building was being evacuated. His duty was done. Instead, he grabbed a bucket, filled it from the 10th floor washroom, and ran down the stairs toward the fire. He made it to the 9th floor landing before the heat and smoke drove him back. He threw the water, a ridiculous, futile gesture against an inferno, and retreated to the roof. He survived to testify at the trial. The defense attorneys painted him as a hero to demonstrate that Triangle's management had tried to fight the fire. What they didn't mention was that Lifskitz had nightmares for the rest of his life about the telephone call that never connected, the warning that never arrived, the women on the 8th floor who died not knowing that help had been just 1 floor above. The NYU law students who laid ladders across the gap between their building and the Ash building's roof deserve their moment too. These were young men, 21 or 22 years old, studying torts and contracts, who suddenly found themselves conducting an aerial rescue operation with no training and improvised equipment. They didn't just lay the ladders and step back. When terrified workers froze at the gap, an 8-foot span over a 10-story drop, the students crawled out onto the ladders and physically guided people across, one hand supporting their backs, one hand holding the ladder. They made dozens of trips, shuttling back and forth until everyone who'd made it to the roof was across. One student, whose name was recorded only as Bernstein, fell from the ladder but caught himself on a lower rung, dangling over the drop for several seconds before pulling himself up and continuing the rescue. He fractured 3 ribs and never mentioned it until someone noticed him wincing while helping the last survivors down. Perhaps the most haunting hero was Dora Appel, a forewoman on the 8th floor who had supervisory responsibility and therefore could have prioritized her own escape. She instead moved through the room as the fire spread, directing women toward any route that looked passable. Witnesses saw her at the freight elevator, at the fire escape, at the windows, always pointing, always shouting directions. The last confirmed sighting of Appel was at the Washington Place stairwell, trying to force open the locked door with a broken chair leg. She was using the chair as a battering ram, smashing it against the lock mechanism over and over. The door never opened. Her body was found in the stairwell, char red beyond easy recognition, identified later by the ring on her left hand. She was 28 years old. These weren't saints or martyrs. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary horror who made split-second decisions that saved lives. History remembers the fire. It forgets the individual acts of courage that prevented the death toll from climbing even higher. Chapter 4. The aftermath that shocked the nation. The first bodies were removed from the building just after 7 p.m., while the steel frame still radiated heat you could feel from across the street. The city morgue on 26th Street prepared for an influx, but nobody quite grasped the scale yet. When the count reached 50, officials realized they'd need more space. They set up a temporary morgue at Pier 26 on the East River, a long, open dock where the bodies could be laid out in rows for identification. That identification process became its own horror. Families lined up along the pier, thousands of them, walking slowly down the rows of burned corpses. Many bodies were identifiable only by jewelry, dental work, or the distinctive pattern of burns. Some families found their daughters or sisters or mothers. Some walked the entire length of the pier without finding anyone, which was almost worse. It left open the terrible possibility that the person they sought was among the unidentifiable remains. The final count, 146 dead, 123 women and girls, 23 men and boys. The youngest identified victim was 14-year-old Kate Leone, the girl who'd been on the fire escape when it collapsed. The oldest was Providenza Pano, 43, a mother of 5 who worked to support her family after her husband's death in a construction accident. 18 victims were never positively identified. They rest in a common grave at the Cemetery of the Evergreens in Brooklyn, under a monument that reads simply, "The Martyrs." The New York World put the story on the front page Sunday morning under a headline that stretched the full width of the paper. 141 men and girls die in waste factory fire. The number would be revised upward as more victims died from their injuries, but the essential horror was already captured. The World's reporter wrote, "I looked upon the heap of dead bodies, and I remembered these girls were the shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike of last year, in which these same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were the answer." That line, "these dead bodies were the answer," resonated because it connected the fire to a labor struggle most New Yorkers remembered vividly. In 1909, the shirtwaist makers had walked out in the uprising of the 20,000, one of the largest strikes by women workers in American history. They demanded better wages, shorter hours, and improved safety conditions. They'd specifically called for unlocked doors, adequate fire escapes, and regular safety inspections. Triangle's owners, Blank and Harris, had been among the most obstinate manufacturers, refusing to negotiate and hiring thugs to break the picket lines. The strike had eventually been settled with modest gains, but the safety demands had largely been ignored. Now, barely 18 months later, the very catastrophe the strikers had warned about had come to pass. The New York Times, typically more conservative than the World, nevertheless ran an editorial that pulled no punches. These girls were victims of the system, of the carelessness and the greed that values dollars above lives. They were sacrificed to the god of production, and their death demands an accounting. What made the Triangle fire impossible to ignore when other industrial disasters had faded quickly was the visibility of the deaths. This hadn't happened in a mine collapsed deep underground, or in a remote factory fire in Pennsylvania, or on a ship that sank out of sight of land. This had happened in broad daylight in lower Manhattan, in full view of hundreds of witnesses. Men and women walking home from work, students heading to dinner, shopkeepers closing their stores. They'd all watched young women burn or fall to their deaths. The trauma was communal and immediate. The Metropolitan Opera House held a mass meeting on April 2nd, 1 week after the fire. The house was packed, all 3,000 seats filled, with hundreds more standing in the aisles and thousands turned away at the doors. Speaker after speaker rose to demand action. Rose Schneiderman, a labor organizer who'd been one of the leaders of the 1909 strike, delivered what became the defining speech of the moment. She stood at the podium, 4'9" tall, and said, "I will be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred." The applause that followed was described by witnesses as more frightening than celebratory. A low, sustained roar of rage that built and built until the entire opera house was shaking. Schneiderman wasn't finished. "This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Each week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Perhaps this shock will make the workers realize that they must have a voice in the making of laws." She sat down to thunderous applause. Many in the audience were weeping. The investigation, when it came, revealed a catalogue of negligence so extensive it bordered on the surreal. The building's fire escapes were inadequate. One had collapsed, the other terminated at the second floor above a locked gate. The stairwell doors had been locked from the outside during working hours. The building had no sprinkler system, though such systems existed and were required in some cities. The fire buckets scattered around the factory contained no water. The factory had never held a fire drill. The ninth-floor executives had had a telephone to call down a warning. The eighth-floor workers had received no alert at all. Blank and Harris, the owners, were indicted on manslaughter charges, specifically that they'd caused the deaths of 23 named workers through criminal negligence. The trial opened in December 1911 and became a referendum on industrial capitalism itself. The prosecution argued that the locked doors constituted knowing endangerment. The defense countered that locked doors were standard industry practice, that Blank and Harris couldn't be held responsible for following common custom, and that in any case, the fire had spread too quickly for unlocked doors to have made a difference. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Family members of the victims had to be restrained by police. Outside, a crowd several hundred strong surged toward the courthouse doors and had to be dispersed with nightsticks. The jury foreman later explained to reporters that while the jury sympathized with the victims, the prosecution hadn't proven beyond reasonable doubt that the specific doors in question had been locked at the specific moment of the fire. A technical deficiency in the evidence, not a moral judgment. But the acquittal, paradoxically, may have done more for the cause of reform than a conviction would have. It demonstrated with crystalline clarity that the legal system, as currently constituted, could not or would not protect workers. The outrage that followed the verdict exceeded even the outrage that had followed the fire itself. Mass demonstrations filled Union Square. Labor organizations that had been at each other's throats for years united in common cause. Politicians who'd been content to ignore industrial safety suddenly found it politically advantageous to champion reform. The coverage wasn't limited to New York. Papers across the country picked up the story. The Chicago Tribune ran a feature on fire hazards in Chicago's garment district. The Boston Globe investigated factory conditions in Massachusetts. The San Francisco Chronicle sent reporters into the city's sweatshops. The fire had become national news, and the nation was paying attention in a way it never had before. In the civil suits that followed, Blank and Harris were found liable for negligent acts that contributed to the deaths. They eventually paid $75 per victim in settlements, less than many had earned in a year of labor. The insurance companies, meanwhile, paid Blank and Harris $445 per sewing machine destroyed in the fire, a sum that exceeded their total settlement payments to victims' families by a factor of 3. The mathematical brutality of this calculation, machines valued higher than human lives, became its own rallying cry. The owners, incredibly, went back into the garment business. Within months, they'd opened a new factory. Within 3 years, they'd been cited repeatedly for safety violations, including locked doors and inadequate fire escapes. The system had taught them nothing because the system demanded nothing of them. The real lesson of Triangle wasn't that individual villains needed to be punished. It was that the entire industrial apparatus needed to be rebuilt from the ground up with worker safety as a structural principle, not an afterthought. Frances Perkins stood in Washington Square on the evening of March 25, 1911, and watched the women fall. She was 31 years old, executive secretary of the New York Consumers League, already an experienced advocate for worker rights. She'd been having tea at a friend's townhouse near the square when someone ran in shouting about the fire. She raced to the scene and witnessed the jumpers, the collapsed fire escape, the futile rescue efforts. She later said it was the most transformative experience of her life, the moment when abstract policy discussions became seared into her consciousness as burned flesh and shattered bones. Perkins channeled her horror into organizing. Within days, she'd convened a meeting of reform-minded New Yorkers and begun planning what became the Committee on Safety of the City of New York. The committee included labor leaders, social reformers, and, crucially, politicians who'd been shaken enough by the fire to contemplate real action. Chief among these was Al Smith, a New York State Assemblyman and future governor, and Robert Wagner, a state senator who would later author much of the New Deal's labor legislation. Both men toured the site. Both heard survivor testimony. Both emerged committed to legislative reform. The result was the Factory Investigating Commission, established by the New York State Legislature in June 1911. For the next 4 years, this commission conducted the most thorough investigation of industrial working conditions ever undertaken in America. They inspected over 1,000 factories. They interviewed hundreds of workers, owners, and safety experts. They compiled reports that ran to thousands of pages, documenting every imaginable hazard: inadequate fire escapes, blocked exits, dangerous machinery, poor ventilation, excessive working hours, child labor, unsanitary conditions. The Commission's recommendations became law with remarkable speed. New York passed over 30 new labor laws between 1911 and 1914, fundamentally reshaping the legal landscape. The laws required adequate fire escapes that actually reached the ground and could support the building's occupant load. They mandated automatic sprinkler systems in factories over 7 stories. They required that doors open outward and remain unlocked during working hours. They limited working hours for women and children. They created a regime of mandatory factory inspections with real penalties for non-compliance. These weren't minor regulatory tweaks. They represented a philosophical shift, the idea that the state had an obligation to protect workers from their employers, that industrial efficiency couldn't be pursued at any human cost, that the market wouldn't self-correct to prevent disasters because the market didn't adequately price human life. The Triangle Fire had demonstrated that workers couldn't protect themselves through negotiation when employers held all the power and could simply lock them in. The specifics matter because they show how directly the laws responded to the fire's lessons. The requirement that doors open outward came directly from testimony about crushed bodies piled against inward-opening doors. The occupant load calculations for fire escapes came from engineering analyses of the Triangle's collapsed fire escape. The sprinkler requirements came from demonstrations showing that an automatic sprinkler system would have contained the Triangle fire to a single floor. Every provision had been written in response to a specific failure that had cost specific lives. New York's reforms rippled outward. Massachusetts passed similar legislation in 1912. Illinois followed in 1913. By 1915, over 20 states had enacted factory safety laws modeled on New York's post-triangle reforms. The momentum carried into the federal sphere, though more slowly. Industrial safety remained primarily a state concern, and the federal government's role wouldn't expand substantially until the New Deal era. But the precedent had been set. Internationally, the Triangle Fire resonated with particular force in Britain, where industrial safety reform had been debated for decades without decisive action. British newspapers covered the Triangle Fire extensively, often contrasting American industrial callousness with supposedly superior British conditions. This proved embarrassing when British reformers pointed out that British factories had many of the same hazards. The 1913 Factory and Workshop Act, which significantly strengthened Britain's industrial safety regime, explicitly cited the Triangle Fire in parliamentary debates. Similar laws followed in Germany, France, and Belgium. The physical changes were substantial. Fire escapes became standard on multi-story factories and tenements. Sprinkler systems became common in industrial buildings. Fire drills became routine, but the philosophical change was even more significant. Before Triangle, industrial safety was seen as primarily the worker's problem. If you didn't like the conditions, work somewhere else. After Triangle, it became understood as a collective social responsibility. The government had an obligation to set minimum safety standards and enforce them. Employers who failed to meet those standards faced criminal penalties, not just civil liability. Workers gained legal grounds to refuse dangerous work. Francis Perkins, who'd witnessed the fire and helped drive the investigation, carried the lessons forward for decades. When Franklin Roosevelt appointed her Secretary of Labor in 1933, the first woman cabinet member in U.S. history, she brought Triangle's legacy into the New Deal. The Fair Labor Standards Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the Social Security Act, all bore the mark of what Perkins had learned in 1911 about the need for government to intervene between capital and labor. She kept a photograph of the ash building on the wall of her office in Washington. When asked about it, she would tell visitors about the fire, about the bodies, about the needlessness of it all. "We never forgot the faces of those who jumped," she said in one interview. "Every piece of legislation we crafted, I would ask myself, would this have saved them? And if the answer was yes, we fought for it." The Triangle Waste Company never returned to operation. The site became, for many years, a standard commercial building housing unremarkable businesses. In 2001, New York University purchased the building and converted it to classroom and faculty office space. In 2003, a modest plaque was installed at the building's entrance. On this site, 146 workers lost their lives in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of March 25, 1911. Out of their martyrdom came new concepts of social responsibility and labor legislation that have helped make American working conditions the finest in the world. That last phrase, the finest in the world, might be debatable, but the essential truth remains. One fire, 18 minutes of hell, 146 deaths. The disaster forced America to confront the human cost of unregulated industrial capitalism and to acknowledge that workers couldn't be treated as disposable inputs in a production equation. The laws that followed weren't perfect. They didn't eliminate industrial accidents or end worker exploitation. But they established the principle that safety isn't a luxury reserved for those who can afford it, that employers bear responsibility for the conditions they create, that the dead deserve more than a shrug and a closed factory. Every fire escape you've ever used, every sprinkler system that saved a building, every emergency exit sign glowing in the dark, every fire drill you've shuffled through at work, they all trace their lineage back to that March afternoon in 1911 when the Triangle Waste Company burned and the conscience of a nation finally, belatedly, painfully awakened. The women who jumped from the eighth-floor windows didn't die in vain, but neither did they die as martyrs who'd chosen sacrifice. They died because the doors were locked and the fire escapes were inadequate, and the owners valued productivity over survival. We remember them not to mythologize their deaths, but to ensure that the reforms born from that tragedy remain permanent. The ashes of the Triangle Fire are long cold. The laws they produced still stand, a bulwark against the casual cruelty that once passed for business as usual. That's the only memorial that matters.